Hey friends, I'm just about to go for a painting adventure. You want to come along? Let's go!
Yay! Cypress Falls Canyon on the North Shore of Vancouver, Canada. This place is so magical. I'm really excited to share this with you. Before we get to any actual plein air painting, I'm going to share some demos and lessons with you. This first one is pretty basic, how much water to use, but the third demo will get into more intermediate or advanced concepts. So how much water to use is really crucial with gouache being a water-based medium. I've seen some debate about this online. I would say the correct amount of water to use with gouache is whatever works for you. For me, I think of it in three categories. This first category is a wet wash. It ends up being pretty similar to watercolor. You can see I'm using enough water to keep it quite wet. If I tilted the palette right now, it would drip. I don't use this a lot in painting, but I do use it for underpaintings. If I want a warm underpainting, I'll make it a transparent wash. You can see I'm getting tons of coverage and a lot of transparency. The burnt sienna acrylic swatch that I have there is really showing through my paint. So with this much water in gouache, it's quite transparent. The second category of consistency is where I spend most of my time painting gouache, and I would describe it as a thick cream. For me, this is where I want to spend my time with gouache, in this consistency. So it's wet enough that I get good coverage, it spreads, and it mixes really nicely. But it's not so wet that it would drip, and it's really quite opaque at this consistency. So more often than not, this is my goal, and I spend some considerable effort trying to manage my gouache to be in this consistency right here. You can see I do have good coverage, I get a lot of paint down, and it's quite opaque, covering up the burnt sienna acrylic. I'm mixing in a gradation now, and you can see I have a window, probably depending on the humidity of your environment, you have like 30 seconds, a minute, where you can blend into the wet paint. This consistency is perfect for the type of painting I try and do in plein air, which is very direct. I just try and charge in. I think about the value and the temperature and the shape that I want, and I just charge in and try and nail it on a single pass and make a lot of mistakes along the way. So this is the third category that I think is really important to be comfortable with, and it's dry brushing. So I've made sure that my brush was absolutely dry, no moisture, no water. This is just gouache straight out of the tube. Undermixing and dry brushing is nice, so not completely blending the colors together, but in this case, allowing some of the blue and the red to stay intact. And you can see in a brush stroke, you get a little bit of color vibrancy happening there. Different temperatures vibrating against each other of similar value. So less coverage, a lot more texture with the cold press paper, and very opaque. You can see I'm definitely covering the burnt sienna. If you're in a drier climate painting in gouache, you're going to spend more time painting with this consistency. And I have one more challenge for you here, and it's to get comfortable with painting a bright, warm color over top of a cool. So it's a bit tricky because if your brush or water are contaminated, if they're brown at all, if there's other colors in there at all, it's going to cool off your bright warm. So the trick is to make sure your brush is really clean, make sure your water is clean. And I'm mixing in the alizarin crimson and lemon yellow with titanium white. So just warm colors and the white to make a very bright, very warm color. And if that blue underpainting is dry, I should be able to cover it up really nicely with this bright warm. This is really, really handy to be able to do this in painting. Sometimes you want a really warm highlight over something cool. So again, the trick is to make your mix really, really clean. I would definitely recommend practicing this. These sort of abstract exercises where you're not trying to complete a painting, you're just playing around with the paint, getting to know the medium, are so valuable. It takes the pressure off of trying to make a beautiful image, and you level up big time. Learning how to control your medium is crucial. You don't want to be struggling with that. All right, back to the adventure.
All right, guys, here's the deal. So as beautiful as this is, I want to get up over this little waterfall. Right around this corner is something big. I can hear it. It's rumbling. So we got to swim across this with our packs, over our heads. This is going to be a cardio test. Let's do it.
This water's freezing cold, by the way. This is one of the things I love about plein air, is the adventure component. And I feel like I'm living a great life after a day like this. For what it's worth, I've been doing Wim Hof breathing exercises for 5 months straight now, every day. And my tolerance for cold has increased significantly. All right, so we're going to do another little lesson here. Value and temperature control. This is absolutely crucial to good painting. So I'm going to start off with a very academic exercise that probably most of you have done already, and it's a 10-step value chart. This is something they get you to do in art school, and it's valuable. I definitely recommend doing it if you haven't done it before. It definitely helps you gain control of your medium, but it's pretty impractical. This doesn't feel like something I use in painting, actually. I never think of 10 separate values when I'm painting. It's more like 2 or 3 or 4. All the work being done here is on the palette before I even start painting the value scale. I'm just working the mix on the palette, trying to get 10 even steps. I really think this exercise is actually tough in gouache. It's easier in oil because you're not fighting the evaporation of water. I'm constantly having to bring in more water without adding too much water that it gets to be a messy pool. And I'm glad I did it. Actually, it exposes a weakness in my value mixing. You'll see it when I've completed this chart here. So gouache dries a different value than what you mix, and that's one of the biggest learning curves to get over if you're going to use this medium successfully. So the brighter end dries darker and the darker end dries lighter. You get used to it, but it definitely takes effort. I struggled with it for a good year or two, but I feel like if you're doing these exercises that I'm sharing with you now, you could get over it quicker, especially the next exercise. So when I complete this chart, you'll see the weakness in my mixing, and it's the step between one, if one is white, between 1 and 2 is too big of a step compared to the rest. And the reason for that is, again, gouache on the high end dries darker, so even just a little bit of black in that white brings it down quite a bit. Okay, this exercise I'm excited for. This is a lot more practical. This is a lot more like actual painting. So I have 2 value swatches, mid-light and mid-dark. Now I'm mixing random colors and trying to match that value swatch. So all of these colors are meant to be mid-light. This feels like actual painting. I use all the time. It's important to be able to group your values and be able to play with color within that value grouping. These 2 values are something that I might use in a direct light setup where we have sunshine illuminating a scene, interacting with materials. Everything in light is maybe mid-light, everything in shadow is maybe mid-dark. And so I want to be able to describe different local colors, have a range of color, and also sculpt form with warm bounce light and cool fill light while maintaining that value structure, while grouping those values. So this exercise is an excellent drill to get better at controlling your value while exploring color temperature. I've added 2 new value color swatches now, light and dark, doing the same thing again. Warms and cools and neutrals. It's pretty tough. It's challenging. How do you make yellow dark? How do you make blue light? Well, making blue light's pretty easy, just add white. Yellow's got to go brown or more orangish to get dark, of course. It's really easy to test the success of this exercise. You can just scan your image in, convert it to grayscale, and if you're getting good at this, you shouldn't see any value variation in each swatch. It should all be the same value. So now I'm adding a 5th value, super dark. This is going to be helpful for contact shadows. And here's a 6th value, highlights. And that's often how I approach painting. Okay, here's one last value exercise, value and temperature exercise. This one is really helpful. We're going to paint 2 rocks. The top rock is a neutral colored rock in cool diffused light. So as I mix brighter, I'm mixing cooler, bringing more blue in with white. And as I mix darker, I'm bringing more red and yellow in. So into the shadow is getting warmer. I also end up adding a little bit of green moss here to bring in a different local color. And then I try and apply the same temperature shift so that the moss is getting warmer in the shadow. And this, to me, is really a big part of what naturalistic painting is about, controlling your temperature along with your value. In this case, every time I'm mixing darker, I'm going warmer. What is the local color and how is it going warmer as it gets darker? What's the local color and how is it looking cooler as it goes lighter? A little bit of a contact shadow and a little bit of specular highlight to finish off. Okay, rock number 2. So this is the opposite. This one is, I find, a little more challenging. This is diffused warm light. So as I mix a brighter value, I'm bringing in more red and yellow. And as I mix a darker value, I'm bringing in more blue. So diffused warm light you would get on a bright sunny day if there's a bit of cloud cover. The top rock is more like an overcast day, a bright overcast day. Really recommend this exercise, getting used to keeping your temperature consistent, whether it's warm light or cool light, while you mix your values is really crucial. Just look at master paintings and you'll see how well they manage this. All right, back to the adventure. That's the fall we just climbed up. And we're really close to our destination now. It's just right around this corner. Sorry for the bumpy cam. I fantasize of getting a drone to do this sort of thing, but this is just a little side hobby when I'm not art directing animation. The big reveal. Here we go. Oh!
Not bad.
All right, lesson 3, painting relationships. Is this circle large? Well, it depends what you're comparing it to. Size and shape are relative. The old checkerboard illusion. So these two highlighted squares are the exact same value. But in context, your brain tells you they're different because you perceive one as being in shadow. Neutral gray feels cool against warm, and warm against cool. Color temperature is very relative. Then I look at a master painting like this by John Singer Sargent, and I'm completely overwhelmed. How could he manage all of these relationships? Every color is relative to every other color, every shape, every value is relative to every other shape and value. When I arrive at a place like this, I can easily be overwhelmed by how complicated the scene is, how everything is interrelated, every color, every shape, every value. It seems unmanageable. So the solution to me is identifying what is special, what it is I'm trying to convey, and what relationships are most fundamental to that concept and feeling. In this case, it's the high contrast and shape of the water against everything else. Let's squint for a moment. Squint really hard. And there you go. The water stands out and everything else is simplified into almost a single value. In the rocks and foliage, there's tons of detail, but the value range is pretty narrow. So it's something like this. The bright value of the water against dark. Everything that isn't water is in a very narrow value range. So on a value chart, our values look something like this. I have a little bit of range in the rock to show form and plane direction, but there's a big gap between the rock and the water. I can't allow the highlights on the rock to get anywhere near the water or the illusion is broken. And that is something I can build a painting off of. So the trick was to sculpt all that detail and to manage all that detail in a very narrow value range and allow all of the value contrast to be between water and everything else. Okay, let's jump into the first plein air painting. It's a very similar feeling and value relationship as what we just looked at. The primary relationship I'm relying on here is the high contrast of the water against everything else. And there's a secondary relationship that I feel is really special here, and it's that there's warm light up top, and as we look down towards the bottom of the canyon, everything's getting cooler. So that would be secondary. My approach to drawing in plein air painting has evolved over the years. It's really trying to be as economical as possible. I don't want to spend much more than a minute or two on the drawing, yet the drawing is crucial. So I need to establish eye level, I need to establish major shapes, I need to establish perspective without actually drawing detail. I use a lot of straight lines. It forces me to be conscientious of the angles. And look how far back I'm holding my brush. It keeps the drawing looser and more energetic. I'm also sort of dry brushing in patches of value here, both to establish some value pattern and also to have more of that warm pigment in what will be the shadowed areas. That warm pigment is really nice to come through in the shadow. So that's about all the drawing I need. I prefer to save any detail drawing for the paint itself, the painting phase. If I want little pebbles, if I want little leaves, I'll draw those with the paint rather than drawing them initially. So I'm starting here with a warm wash. I start paintings differently depending on my goals, but I know I want that luminescent warmth up top. So that's what I'm starting with. It's kind of hard to get a warm glow at the end. It's easier to establish that at the beginning, I find. And then as I move forward, essentially my big goal now is to establish a grouping of values in the rocks. It all needs to be grouped to mid dark. Even the rocks in the light, they're not much lighter than the rocks in the shadow. The contrast in the video, of course, is a little messed up from the camera exposure. It looks different in real life. So I'm using a big brush. I think that's 1.5 inches flat. And trying to cover a lot of area and establish big shapes, big groups of value. And I'm leaving out the water itself because it's a bright value and the board I'm using is bright. Therefore, its value is kind of already established. It's kind of already there. I'm trying to achieve this value relationship, the bright water against everything else being dark, as directly and as efficiently as possible. I want it working as quickly as possible. Within that value grouping, you can see I'm trying to sculpt some plane changes and form. You can see the upper planes of some of the rock are cooler, so I've mixed in more white and blue without allowing the value to change too much. The colors on my palette are ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, and cadmium yellow light, plus titanium white. Again, just filling in more of that rock, everything other than the water as being mid-dark. Creating some color variations in there to suggest the moss and different materials, all while maintaining that value structure, which really calls back to that previous exercise we did of creating color variations in the same value range. You can see those rocks on the bottom are cooler, they're facing upwards. The cool sky fill light is cooling that top surface off. And also I want the bottom of this painting to be overall cooler than the warm upper area. I spray the painting every now and then. I spritz it just to keep the paint mixable a little bit. It's dangerous. I definitely don't want it dripping. Blocking in the water now. So as it shifts into that shadow, it's getting warmer because it's a cool diffused light. So I'm putting a fair amount of the burnt sienna and alizarin crimson into the shadows here. There's my darkest dark. So here I am intentionally going darker than that grouping of values. But the whole trick is the biggest value contrast here is between the water and everything else. As long as I respect that relationship, I can get away with bringing in other values. So the value structure relationship is pretty well established. I'm throwing in some darker darks now, showing in cracks and crevices in the rocks, sculpting some form, creating some patterns and rhythm throughout the rocks. Before this paint dries, I want to jump into the water so that I could blend the edges a little bit. That's a big thing with painting waterfalls is having some soft edges where the water is turning to vapor. Accentuating some of the cooler top surfaces of the rocks now, using color temperature to sculpt form and further describe some of the rhythms. I love this canyon so much. The angles that have been sculpted out of the granite bedrock over millennia is just incredible. Endless inspiration. Okay, so I'm getting in some of the darker areas of the waterfall now where the rock is showing through, and before that dries I want to jump in with the brighter water, and that way I can mix those values and get some nice blending happening. little bit of dry brushing in there to show the texture of the water as it's falling, combined with some wet and wet to soften the edges and have it feel misty. To me, edge work is sort of the icing on top, shape and value being the foundation that the painting is built on. Color temperature kind of being what can bring in some really nice feeling and mood, or build upon feeling and mood that is established by your values. And then edge work can really just finish it off and bring it home. But edges won't save poor values, that's for sure. Some really interesting patterns down towards the bottom of the waterfall where there's sort of shelved rocks peeking through the water, and the water splashing off of them. Just about done. So this painting was about an hour in total. I was standing there in my bathing suit. I ditched my clothing back before the previous waterfall that we swam through. I was so cold, standing in shadow in this cold, wet canyon, shaking the whole time I was painting this. So this has been sped up to, I think, about 3 times speed. Painting water, I find being direct really helps. Even if it's not perfect, having it loose and direct feels like it's moving more so than anytime I really try and render water. It ends up looking stiff, which is kind of the opposite quality of how water actually feels and looks. A little bit of speckling on the bottom there for some mist and splatters. While the splatter's still wet, I can wipe it from areas I don't want it. I don't really want too much of it in the darkest shadow area. So there we go. The goal was to convey some of the feeling and essence of this place and experience of being there. And I've built this painting on the concept of a value relationship, being that the water is bright and everything else is relatively dark. So any value variation I have other than the water needs to be closely grouped. And although I see things I'd do differently next time, it feels good to go to a place like this and be able to sketch it in under an hour and have some feeling come through as to what it was like to actually be there. This is something that cameras don't do very well. In Richard Schmidt's book Alla Prima, so often he mentions how when he was working on a painting, his wife would step in and say, stop painting now, it's beautiful, you'll only ruin it. I have to play that role for myself. I think a lot of us need to keep that in mind, especially for this sort of sketching. Again, this is not meant to be a polished image, but a sketch. And so I'm kind of watching this now. I'm thinking, okay, stop, you're good, stop, don't ruin it, don't overwork it. I think part of it is it just feels so good to be in that state of mind, to be in the painting. I don't want it to end. I just want to stay there, flow state. A little more dry brushing on top, a little more texture of the water falling, bouncing off the rocks. It is really fun. I think that just about does it. No, wipe that. So after I finished this painting, I was so cold. I was ready to get out of this canyon, and I turned around and the lighting had changed in the canyon. The sun was getting higher in the sky, and right behind me, this warm, brilliant light was coming down into the canyon. So the second plein air painting is a study in temperature relationships. That's what I noticed first about where we're going to paint next. So I wanted to show you something quickly in Photoshop. So when we're dealing with really warm light illuminating an entire scene, the relative nature of color temperature really comes into play, and it's essentially that the cools in this scene are really neutrals. I don't want to go anywhere near blue. It breaks the relationship. And it's because there's so much warm light, direct light, and warm bounce light that even the coolest areas in the scene are being warmed up. So in a really bright, warm light, a blue shirt is going to look more neutral than blue. So this is kind of, a temperature range that works for a scene that is bathed in warm light. And I'm going to bring in some shadows into the brighter area. So if this is a pool lit by warm light, these could be rocks. And you can see it's darker and a little more neutral, not quite as warm, and it feels cool. And as I bring in more shadows farther away from the main spotlight, I can go darker and even cooler, but still it's relatively cool. It's actually still quite a warm color. It's just compared to that bright orange yellow, it's relatively cooler. So in this quick little exercise, I'm just kind of seeing like how dark and cool I can get and still maintain this overall temperature relationship. And so far this works. Now I'll show you what doesn't work. If I went into this area and threw in some blues, it's dead. The painting just died. That doesn't feel believable to me. So that's what we're going to try and avoid. It's these sorts of plein air paintings, plein air sketches that have really taught me a lot about this concept. And here we go. So I had turned around from that last waterfall painting, and this brilliant warm light was coming into the canyon and illuminating this pool of water. The water was pretty yellow-orange in local color, and then with the warm light hitting it, it was just brilliantly warm. Now, what is totally wrong about the video footage is in real life, there's so much warm bounce light that the whole scene was far warmer than what shows up on camera. So my approach, my start to this painting is much different than the last one. In the last one, I was trying to establish a value relationship first. In this one, I'm trying to establish a temperature relationship first. So that's my underpainting, is a temperature relationship. It's hot in the focal area, and then it goes from yellow into orange, as you can see. Quickly laying down some drawing, again, straight lines, trying to establish big shapes, how they fit within the canvas, where my eye level is, and some perspective. And then my approach to painting this is really starting with the brightest warms and moving outwards. It's kind of similar to how if you're painting a vast landscape and your goal is depth, a good approach is to paint farthest away to nearest. So you're constantly getting darker and more saturated. Well, it's a similar approach, but in this case, I'm painting from the brightest, warmest outwards into darker and relatively cooler. So I start with this transition from like hot yellow into orange and red, right away setting up that temperature relationship. So now anything I paint next to this is going to feel cooler because this is as hot as my color palette will get. So there's burnt sienna in this shadow, and just a little touch of ultramarine blue, barely any. And right away I've kind of established how cool I want to go. Trying to get that water in while it's still wet so the paint can really blend, and the brush strokes and the undermixed paint is kind of suggesting the movement of the water. So this sort of temperature study is dangerous in that if I go into that focal area where it's bright and hot with any sort of contamination to the paint, it's going to be too cool. I need to really protect that warm area from anything cool. Even white is going to feel really cool in that area as I'm painting white. So there's actually red and yellow in this mixture that I'm adding right now. So these are rocks in the spotlit area. And you can see some shadows going into the rocks now. Again, they barely have the tiniest amount of blue in them, being really careful not to get too cool. Because that whole area has light bouncing all around it, warm light bouncing everywhere. So even the darkest shadows are warmed up a lot and even brightened up by the bounce light. So here's some of the coolest temperature in the painting so far. It's not going to get much cooler than this. The rocks on the outside away from the spotlight that are facing upwards, getting some cool sky fill on them. So in establishing that, I've really kind of set the parameters for what the temperatures of this painting will be. This area right there is some of that rock cliff pointing down towards the spotlight, and it's just wonderfully lit up by that bounce light. It's definitely something I want to include in this painting. This painting's all about bounce light. So this is actually going to be one of the darkest areas of the painting, but I'm putting down that really warm red because I want that to kind of come through in my darkest shadows. Again, trying to keep everything quite warm. But if my shadows are relatively cooler than that warm base, it'll have a nice vibrancy to it. Whereas if I just painted cool shadows, it wouldn't be as vibrant. Bringing in some greens for that foliage now. Trying to integrate and manage a different local color into this temperature relationship that I've established. So those greens, as they get anywhere near light, are going to be very yellow. Generally speaking, in nature, greens have a lot of red in them. That's kind of a big trick I've learned. I mean, there's no like hard rules, but bringing in red keeps the greens earthier rather than artificial. So as the greens get darker, yes, I'm adding ultramarine blue, but also quite a bit of alizarin crimson red, keeping it pretty warm. Relatively cooler than the spotlight here, but still with some warmth. These quick sketches, foliage, I really try more often than not to not paint leaves, but to paint volume. I try and paint the volume of foliage and to suggest the leaves with some quick brushwork and texture. Actually, the texture suggests the individual leaves, and I'm focusing more on the volume and how the volume interacts with the temperature of light. Getting down those dark shadows in the background now, and you can see how the warmth of that underpainting is kind of playing through those dark shadows. I just remember feeling in love with that down-facing cliff in the back there that's picking up all that bounce light. It is just such a magical effect. And as that form turns away from the spotlight, you can see it cools off, relatively cools off. So the big thing is like a neutral is going to feel cool here. Whites are going to feel cold in this painting. Just reminding myself that the whole time I painted this. Don't go too cool. Go neutral for cool. I've learned to embrace imperfections. And actually, at the end of a painting, so often it's those imperfections that give it a sense of energy. The expectation for perfection is kind of ridiculous. I don't think it's what art is about, that's for sure. I mean, mastering your medium, understanding fundamentals, working hard to build a really strong foundation of fundamentals is super important, but that's not perfection. You might look at a master painting and say, oh, it's perfect, but pretty sure if you talk to the master, they don't feel it's perfect. So I try not to paint over my mistakes. If I make a mistake, if it's not like destroying the painting, I just try and leave it. So the values, the temperatures, the shapes have all been established at this point. I'm just sort of adding some nuances now. And also the water rapids still need to go in, or I want to bring them in. This was I was excited about. There in the distance there was some splashing of water in that spotlit area, and it was, you know, in front of that distant shadow, so the bright water really stood out in front of that shadow, which was pretty fun. Sorry, my footage leapt forward there. I think the footage was actually damaged painting out there in the canyon. So you can see I put in those rapids. I feel like I messed those up. They're too cool for my taste. Had they been more neutral, I feel like they would have sit in the scene better. I think I'm used to going very cool on those rapids in shadow because they're facing upwards towards the sky and they're picking up a lot of cool fill light. But in this case, with all this bounce light in this scene, they're too cool. I think I started feeling like there's too many small brush marks, so I think here I bring in some larger broad strokes to try and kind of consolidate some areas of rest, so not everything is so busy as I add more busyness and detail. Made sure there's a fair amount of yellow in this mix right now. That white in the light needs to feel warm, and just pure white would be too cool. I'm going to push that darkest dark in the back a little bit. You can see how warm that mix is too. There's a lot of red and brown in this mixture. Adds more contrast near the focal area and pushes that background even farther. I often save the darkest darks and the lightest lights for last. So in a painting like this, I will, in contradiction to what I said earlier, paint a couple leaves. But I'm trying to have it feel like it's kind of coming into focus and then blurring out of focus in areas. So it feels like there's leaves everywhere going in and out of shadow, and in certain areas of light you can see the definition of individual leaves, and then let the brain fill in the rest. These last little highlights definitely had to keep really warm. A lot of yellow in with that white. It's a very dry mixture, so it's super opaque. So although these two paintings were different approaches and different focuses, the common factor was asking myself what is special about this scene and what relationship is most fundamental to that quality. In the first one, it was the contrast of the value between the water and everything else. That's what felt special, so that's what I built the painting off of. That's what I started with. And in this one, what felt special was that warm spotlight and all the warm bounce light it was creating. And that's how I started this. That's how I approached it. And that's what I focused on. So by focusing on the primary relationship, subordinate relationships can be built off of that. successfully. So I don't have to think about every single minute little relationship between each shape and each value and each temperature. But if I can establish the broad relationships first, I can then create little variations within that structure and get some of the nuances that exist in nature. How do you start a painting is such a great question, and I've heard so many different answers, and I start differently so often. I have approaches that work better in certain conditions or certain goals, and focusing on these broad foundational relationships is just sort of the latest of approaches and ways of thinking that I'm learning about. And then in the long run, I end up sort of combining and having a range of approaches and concepts that give me some versatility, allow me to tackle different challenges, different lighting scenarios, different moods. So there's the two paintings we did. I have a free PDF for you all to download on my website. The link to my site is in the video description. In the PDF, I've listed my complete materials list for gouache plein air painting, as well as a few different limited palettes of color I like to work with, and a bunch of exercises that if you do daily or frequently, you'll see big improvement really quickly. Happy painting to you all. Thanks so much for hanging out. Take care.